Welcome to the last unprecedented before the election. I'm Michael Popok. That's Dina Dahl, and we're going to cover all things United States Supreme Court at the week in a continuing experiment we call unprecedented, and for a reason. As I predicted, Dina, the court is going to be involved, whether we like it or not, in the elections. And I mean this election, having already laid the blueprint for how they're going to get involved in the 2020 election. And we're already seeing MAGA and other groups running to the United States Supreme Court or filing applications to get there on an emergency basis in real time about voting issues right now, early voting, provisional ballot voting, mail in voting. It's all up for grabs. We've got cases that are bubbling below the surface that haven't yet hit the United States Supreme Court, like the Fifth Circuit's decision about some Mississippi mail in ballots. We've got a sort of a mirror image case that has made it to the Supreme Court concerning Pennsylvania ballots and provisional ballots. We've got the United States Supreme Court making a major ruling that certain Americans in Virginia who properly registered are going to be purged from the rolls and not be allowed to vote, at least based on this new ruling. And then we've got candidates all trying to either get off the ballot, get on the ballot, and in some cases the same candidate is trying to get off the ballot and on the ballot depending upon the state. His name is RFK Jr. Who else? Mr. Worm in the Brain guy. We're going to cover it all on this unprecedented. Dina, how you doing? Are you wearing a vote badge? Why is that, Dina?
Because I voted.
I did too. But you did something more. You did something that I've done in the past as well, which is you were a poll observer, right?
I was a poll observer in Clark County, Nevada, at a really big more than one polling location, but one of them was a big polling location. 1,500 people were voting there a day. And there were people going past the 100-yard demarcation where all campaigning is supposed to completely stop, wearing their MAGA hats. Reported it to the poll workers like I was supposed to, and they said that they don't ask them to take it off because they create too much of an issue. And there is that viral video going around where a MAGA person kind of assaulted a poll worker for trying to have them take off the hat. So the tension in that polling location was huge. There was a Trump truck out in the parking lot with signs, and they weren't getting to the level of harassment, so that part was legal. But wow, if you haven't voted yet, vote, because I could feel it on the ground. This is really tense, and we have to overwhelmingly come out and vote to, that the entitlement and aggressiveness of some of those voters. You could just see at a random polling location. And
I sort of want them to wear their MAGA hat. It's the same feeling I have about the KKK. I kind of want them to wear their white hoods, because then I can see who they are. I can see which neighbors of mine are so crazed that they think it's appropriate to campaign at a polling place. I let them wear their. It doesn't change a vote. I mean, the question is whether it's suppressing a vote because it's intimidating somebody else who just doesn't want to put up with it. In 2020, I was a poll watcher in Florida at a place that I had voted 4 years earlier for Hillary Clinton, and before that for Barack Obama. This time it was absolutely a madhouse with MAGA, with all sorts of disgusting comments about Kamala Harris even then, against Joe Biden even then. They had been working, I'm sure it happened in Nevada too, the MAGA Republicans have been working Spanish language radio overtime in Florida. By the time I got there, it was just this these giant MAGA flags and everything. And a young woman, I still remember this, a young woman couldn't take it anymore. I think she was a Democrat or progressive. She ran across the street to confront the disgusting things that these guys were saying to a whole bus of church voters, primarily Black, and she couldn't take it anymore. She went over, she snapped, and she got in their grill and she touched one of the guys on the chest, and he acted like he was physically assaulted, and he had her arrested. And we watched it all go down. So, we're fighting for the soul of America. And, we question whether the United States Supreme Court is in our corner or not.
Right. Yeah. And to your point about wearing the hat, absolutely, except where they're legally not supposed to. I'm tired of Trump acting as if he's above the law, and then all of his
Yeah.
followers do the same.
No,
So
my point is it's like the KKK. I was making a joke. No, they shouldn't be. I don't want anybody violating the law or getting within 100 yards and 100 feet. You did the right thing. Let's talk about what the Supreme Court's doing. We'll do it in some order. Let's start with the Purge, the Election Day edition. I thought that was just a movie. I didn't realize that was a thing the Supreme Court would do. So we had a Virginia judge, Judge Giles, federal court, who didn't like what she heard, primarily that Virginia and its Republican legislature had farmed out to the effectively the Department of Motor Vehicle. They'd farmed out to the Department of Motor Vehicle to determine who was eligible to vote or not. Can we all just think about that for a minute? Think about your experience, individual experiences at the Department of Motor Vehicle. Do we really want them in charge of determining whether someone's a citizen and eligible to vote or not? And so she was troubled by that. She was troubled by the fact that at least 40 or so people in a sample that the Biden administration had done had demonstrated that they were citizens, they were lawfully able to vote, yet they were purged and stripped from the rolls. And the main problem was this violated a 1993 law, right? We have a law on the books since 1993 because of these problems that says you can't make a systemic change to your voter rolls, primarily the other party out of power, because you want to screw the party that you want to diminish the vote of other people. So within 90 days of an election, you're not allowed to purge the voter rolls. That's exactly what Youngkin, sorry, and the rest in Virginia did. But that decision went up to the Supreme Court. What happened?
yeah, so the Supreme Court basically said that they can purge it. They reversed the lower federal court ruling and allow them to proceed with the purging, at least for now. They might take another look at it. But the fact is that 90-day rule here is the thing that made it kind of so astounding that they did it, because that law is really clear. And, they could have done it 6 months ago, and then there wouldn't have been any question of the law. Nobody wants somebody who's not a citizen to vote in our election. But the problem is, when you come up against the 90 laws, the people that were purged do have a chance to cure it. They get notified. They can, they have 2 weeks to cure it. But, people are busy, right? What if you don't get the notice? What if that comes late? You're coming too close to the day of the election. So for such a very clear rule like that, the fact that the Supreme Court, one, was willing to step in at all. We have talked about in other episodes, Popok, how willing will the Supreme Court be to step into this election, because they hurt their credibility quite a bit with Bush v. Gore, and they were relatively quiet in the 2020 election. They didn't take a lot of the cases that Trump wanted them to. So the fact that they stepped in here, backing the purging, despite the fact that this 90-day law is very clear, I think is an alarmist sign. Good news is the GOP don't have a lot of very strong claims that they're trying to make. But if there's anything with any kind of meat on it, I think that this ruling shows that the Supreme Court is not going to be shy about stepping in for Trump, as we've seen here with this ruling and the other ones regarding Trump.
Yeah, I think that it's a bad sign that they're purging, or they're allowing because once they're purged, that means people can't vote. That's what it means. That's why Judge Giles at the Virginia level, the federal court level, was like, we'll sort this out. Let them vote. And if it turns out that they aren't registered to vote properly, or they're not citizens in this case, that'll get sorted out by the criminal justice system. I mean, just to show you but she was more worried about all the registered voters or actual Americans that would have their vote thrown out with the bathwater, along with trying to get rid of this. And just to show you this is a non-problem and just a big fat excuse to commit voter suppression by the Republicans. Georgia, sort of a neighboring state there to Virginia, did an audit of 8.2 million votes in the 2020 election. Do you know how many of the 8.2 million votes were non-citizens
I think
voting?
8, right?
Guess. 12.
12. I was close.
Well, but you're closer
Yeah.
too, because about half of it were people that registered but didn't even vote,
Okay.
and the other half was voting.
Okay.
So it's like
Yeah.
six. This is 0.0002%. This is not outcome determinative fraud, but you shouldn't in America be okay with any American being disenfranchised through this broad brushed kind of ruling. But there you have it. And now let's turn to what's going on in Pennsylvania, by extension, Mississippi, or the Fifth Circuit, and how the United States Supreme Court is getting involved with voting at the molecular level. What's going to be a provisional ballot? What's going to be actually counted in the election? A provision, just for people, because we use this term a lot in shorthand, and I want to explain it to people. So when you go to vote, or you have voted, if everything is checks all the boxes. It's you, it's your signature, you're registered to vote, you're an American citizen, you're in the right precinct. Boom. That ballot should be actually cast and counted in the election. If you show up or your mail-in vote, something happens to it and something's missing, you didn't sign and date the back, and every state's different. That's the other thing that drives our European friends crazy on Legal AF and here on this channel. It's like, what do you mean it's not uniform? It's not uniform. Every state under the Constitution is allowed to determine the time, manner, and means of how you vote, even in federal elections. So we got this weird thing, hybrid, where states determine how their citizens are going to vote in federal elections, as opposed to a federal mandated way to do it, uniform way to do it. And we always get into trouble because of it. So every state's a little bit different. So sometimes you have to sign on the back. Sometimes there's two envelopes that you have to sign both. You have to date both of them. You have to put a fingerprint on one of them. And if you show up in person, maybe you had switched precincts and it didn't get properly recorded, but you do live in that town and you do register and you have the card, but they don't have it on the rolls, some version of that. So they go, well, we can't figure it out. So here's a ballot, but we'll mark it provisional, meaning we'll sort it out and we won't even count it. If we need to count it, depending upon the outcome of the election, we'll count it, but we'll have to do more research on these. So you're in this provisional pile, and you've got states, right, and Democrats that are like, count every vote and sort it out later, or some version of that. What's going on in Pennsylvania, and what is the GOP in a battleground state that could be razor thin margins? Although I have my doubts about that. What are they doing, and what is the Supreme Court doing about it?
Yeah, and to speak to provisional ballots, and another role of being a poll observer is we track down the people that voted provisionally to follow up to help them cure, as we say, or fix the issue that caused them to vote. That is how much every vote matters. If you didn't believe it, that's the effort that goes into it. And that is also why the GOP is trying to do this lawsuit in Pennsylvania. The number of votes that they're estimating it. They don't know yet, obviously, because in Pennsylvania, as we know, they're not allowed to start counting their ballots until the day of election. That's what Republicans want, because they like to look like, oh, there's some sort of fraud, the vote count is changing. But how that also affects Pennsylvania is they can't necessarily tell if there's a problem with the ballot yet, because they haven't opened up their ballots, right? So they've kind of done a little bit of a workaround, which I'll explain. But the bottom line is it's an estimate right now of what they think the number of ballots that is affected, and about 8,000. So if Pennsylvania comes that close, Biden won it by a lot more, but if it's that close, this lawsuit will be big. The GOP is asking the Supreme Court to basically stop the counting of these provisional ballots in Pennsylvania if you did not sign the back of your ballot, if you didn't date the back of your ballot, or they have like a secret envelope inside their envelope. If they didn't kind of double envelope it, as they call it, that's considered a naked ballot, and that's not counted. So if you have those issues, with this timing of them, they're trying to take a look at some of the ballots. But again, as you say here, every county is different. It's up to the registrar of voters of each county. And some counties are like, well, we can see the back of the ballot, right? We don't need to open it. So they already are starting to track down mistakes and trying to follow up with voters. Other counties are like, we're not even going to take a look at this. So it's a little bit a haphazard, but there's thousands of ballots basically that is at issue with these possible mistakes that the GOP wants the Supreme Court to not count, saying that these ballots basically can't be fixed, can't be cured, shouldn't be counted. And Alito, I know you have you're going to talk a little bit about this, Popok. The interesting thing about it is that he, the order of whether or not to take the case, or the request, let's say, of whether or not to take the case, is going to go through him. So I know you have some thoughts about that in particular.
Well, I want to manage expectations for our audience and keep our eyes on the prize here. I mean, Sam Alito, who used to be a New Jersey judge, he was eventually elevated to the Third Circuit, which covers New Jersey, before he made his way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And every year, Chief Justice Roberts, assigns one of the 13 circuits to one of the 9 Supreme Court justices to be what we call the duty judge, or the presiding judge or justice over that circuit. And there's more circuits than there are justices. Some of them have more than one. Chief Justice Roberts, as his prerogative as the chief judge, Chief Justice, always gets the D.C. Court of Appeals. So things that come out of D.C. and the federal circuit go up to him. He gets those two. And then he sort of figures out, frankly, what states are red and what states are blue, and giving out, like, he put, of course, Sotomayor has New York, Ketanji Brown Jackson, she's from Florida, but he can't give her Florida the 11th because it leans right. He gave that to Clarence
Oh,
Thomas.
goodness.
So he has to give her, like, like Kagan, like California. So he puts the 3 liberal progressives, he gives them the liberal progressive states, and he gives the rest to MAGA. And Alito, unfortunately, sits over Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania is part of the third, and that was his old stomping grounds. And the problem with that is, he can make decisions without even sending it over to the full 9 of the panel. That's one. Or they can make decisions through a shadow docket where there's not full briefing and they just make a decision. And we've been saying a little bit of both of
Mhm.
those lack of transparencies. It's just unfortunate that the battleground states justice happens to be Alito for future challenges and things. And they were already, I just did a set of interviews with Court Accountability yesterday, and they're on the ground in Pennsylvania. It's already a shit show, with MAGA and lawyers and protesters and Stop the Steal and everything else. And so that was my
Mhm.
comment about Alito.
Yeah, no, which is very valid. It makes a lot of difference who that initial judge is, for sure. And to the point about the differences in our county and our counting, and the one thing is it helps our country not actually to have elections hacked. Just as a little side note, because we do it so differently, and it is up to each registrar how they do it. It does keep it a little bit tricky for like some outside influence like Russia to kind of hack our system, because it is so different. And speaking of that, we have the different candidates, right, who are trying to get on the ballot, off the ballot. RFK Jr. wanted to get off the ballot only in certain battleground states, right? He was successful in North Carolina. The North Carolina State Supreme Court basically, halted the printing of the ballots, made them reprint the ballots, to get him off, even though he had missed the deadline. And he asked the Supreme Court to essentially do the same thing with Wisconsin and Michigan. He wanted to be removed there because when he's on the ballot, he hurts Trump. So what do you think about that one?
I think he's a crackpot, and with the further away we keep him from the White House and not in charge of our science policy or medicine or science or medicine, the better. I mean, I remember when corporate media got all excited because RFK Jr. was leaving the race, and after trying to sell himself to the highest bidder and Kamala rejecting him, he then made a pact with Donald Trump, in return for he's going to be in charge of science and medicine policy. If he right, and they were all like, "Oh, he's got 1.5% of the electorate, and if he goes over in a close election and all of that." He's not able to deliver the 1.5% because most of them were voting for him because they didn't want to vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump. So they didn't want to vote for Donald Trump when he went over there. So I guess his last devil's bargain he made with Donald Trump was, I'll stay on where it helps you and I'll come off the ballot where it hurts you. So in the battleground states, of course, of Wisconsin and Michigan, which is the clearest and easiest path for Kamala Harris to take the presidency, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I had it backwards, but there. If she picks that up, she will be Madam President elect. There's other ways to do it if she doesn't get those exact three. It's just harder. And so he argued to the Supreme Court 3 weeks ago, I want to stay on the ballot in New York. And they said, why? So, well, because he didn't really have a good reason. It's because he thought he could siphon a couple of votes here and there from Kamala Harris, or maybe, it would never happen. She's going to win New York. He's going to win New York by 10 to 12 points. But he was arguing. And then, of course, that helped defeat his argument that he was making. And I loved how his mind works. He argued to the Supreme Court that they should allow little stickers to go over his name on the ballot. Now, 150,000 or more people have already voted in these states. So I don't understand how the sticker thing was going to work. It shows you how his brain works. And the Supreme Court was like, no, you're on the ballot. You're not off the ballot. People can vote however they like, and that's just what we're going to do. And then Cornel West, for who knows what, I don't know if he has like a personal vendetta against Kamala Harris or the Democratic Party. He's a professor. He's progressive. I don't know if this is like a opposition candidate or a candidate of conscience, or something. He's like running. So he wanted the Supreme Court to order something.
Yeah, so he wanted there to be signs in Pennsylvania notifying voters that he can be a write in candidate. Probably one of the most interesting arguments I've heard. Maybe you and I should do that one time.
I've written my name in before.
And let's be writing candidates.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, of course, the Supreme Court said no. I mean, even this Supreme Court, who's willing to do almost anything for Trump, there's certain lines they won't cross, and kind of a nonsensical argument like that is something that I mean, anybody could be a writing candidate at this point. Doesn't make sense. And also, he could put up his own signs beyond the 100-yard demarcation.
101 inch away.
101 inch away. Go ahead, Cornel West, get your signs up. Nothing is stopping you but this idea that like he has a right to notify the voters is.
I'd like to stop talking about these fringe third party candidates who are just screwing things up, like Jill Stein of the Green Party, pulling a Ralph Nader, just going to screw it up. But I do have one comment here at the end of Unprecedented, and I just did a hot take on it. I'm not as concerned about some of the polling that's going on there. There's some good reporting in the Guardian and the New York Times, Forbes magazine, that we're seeing some phony polls here at the end. The weaponization of polls by MAGA, who are stepping into the vacuum created by legitimate pollsters who are nonpartisan, stepping out of the polling business because they got burnt so many times. And then left in the vacuum are Republican and very partisan polling companies. And that's why I know that independent statisticians and pollsters have looked at the polls. They say it's actually impossible for the race to be either as close as they're arguing and or that Donald Trump is ahead in the battleground states. It's just not the way polling works. But the reason for it, and the reason why even the Wall Street poll of voting is being manipulated, is because it's a form of voter suppression. It sounds counterintuitive. You think if it looks like your candidate is losing, you'll be more inclined to vote. But that's not how it works. If it looks like you're on the losing ticket, it might deflate your enthusiasm, and you don't show up and wait in those long lines or do whatever you have to do. So that there's two reasons that these phony polls are being promoted by MAGA. And why, for instance, there were 37 polls which leaned partisan right that have been done in the last 2 weeks. And Donald Trump has won 30 out of 37. And the traditional pollsters are like, it's impossible. It is impossible. And it can't be this close in every state. And so what they think is that it's masking that Kamala is really ahead by healthy margins in the battleground states, and that this is going to be a blowout. And the reason in her favor, and the reason that they're doing it, the Republicans, is it gives the litigators for Donald Trump and Donald Trump himself the ability to go in court and talk about the stolen election. We were up all the polls, 6-8 points. How could this be? Stop the steal. That's all we're watching. So I guess the messaging I'm trying to lay out here for our audience on Unprecedented is ignore the polls. The only poll that matters is the poll that you attend on election day, or if you've already voted. And this other stuff, We just have to, once she wins, and I'm reasonably confident she is going to, and not just by a little. I think it's well over 300 electoral votes for Kamala Harris. We'll come back next week and talk about it, how I did on that. But if I'm right about that, and Donald Trump uses violence again, and he moves from violent political rhetoric to actual violence on the ground, we need our institutions and, unfortunately, federal judges and Supreme Court to step forward and say this election was not stolen. This affirmatively say it. It's almost impossible to have a stolen election given the complexities of voting and how many people you'd have to have in that conspiracy in order for that to happen. It's virtually impossible for that to happen, and we just have to stand sturdy when the inevitable repeat Jan 6 2.0 tries to be played against us.
Absolutely. The tension in that polling place, this is ready to boil over. And not only do the polls suppress the vote, they suppress volunteers. The Harris campaigns needs a ton of volunteers, and volunteering takes time. And if you think your candidate's going to lose, you're not going to do it. And also, the other thing, not only are they trying to hijack the polls, but they're filing all of these frivolous lawsuits and losing because the argument can become, oh, the courts are stopping us from their election integrity. Like in Nevada, they just filed something saying that if the post office, forgets to put a postmark on it as they deliver the mail, like it shouldn't be counted. These kind of nonsensical things that are just being dismissed, the Georgia Election Board. The reason why they're filing these lawsuits, despite the fact that their lawyers have to know they're going to lose, is it makes good headlines, it makes good arguments, it makes it, they're winning through the court system instead of actually through the votes. That's why I'm glad we are focusing so much on the Supreme Court. And today, the election, and I'm sure probably next week, frankly, there'll be some Supreme Court developments with the election, because we're going to be having conversations with our neighbors, with our friends, and they're going to say things like, yeah, but in Nevada, the Supreme Court, said that if they don't have a postmark, and we need to know the facts so that we can have conversations. And, some people are completely unconvincible, but there's others out there that, armed with the right information, each one of us are now empowered to be the media and to distribute information. And that's going to be crucial because the counter information avalanche is coming. For sure.
Yeah, it's already here. It's also being promoted by our foreign enemies who are jumping on the bandwagon. There are substantial Russian trolling operations going on right now, along with Chinese ones and Iranian ones, to try to play into these weak underbellies and our Achilles heel and exploit them and put Americans at each other's throats and set us one against the other. And they're playing into that, and they're doing the polls, and they're manipulating the polls. And it's a sucker's bet to follow whatever you hear on social media. Come to Unprecedented, come to Legal AF. You're here already. Hit the free subscribe button. There's no election interference here. Just hit the button. We're going to hit 270,000 subscribers by the time we reach Election Day. We're going to go over 18 million views by the end of the weekend, just in 5 weeks on this channel. And we appreciate it, and we appreciate your support for this new show, this unprecedented show. And we'll be back, right, Dina? We'll be back next week, right after the election, talking about, hopefully, the win of Kamala Harris and then what the United States Supreme Court and other federal courts are doing about it. So until our next,
I cannot wait.
I know, I can't wait either. Good luck. Vote.
Yes,
And we'll see you next week on Unprecedented. In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories, the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.